Modernism, Europe and America, 1900 to 1945. Before we start, there are different reasons for creating art. There are personal and cultural functions of art. We see how this fit into the movements that we study. People make art for spiritual and religious purposes to honor people that they considered good or noble. We also make art for political purposes to speak passionately about our beliefs or the beliefs of other culture and our culture. Artists also keep a record of history and commemorate events. Sometimes art is made for purely aesthetic purposes, like, for example, I just want to hang something beautiful on the wall, or I'm going to paint a picture. Also, for self expression, like how do I express who I am and what I'm feeling through a visual medium. Modern art is much more complicated than those other art movements and art terms because of the sheer breadth and variations of art that is defined as modern. For example, Impressionism is defined by a set of rules and visually defining factors, and it is also complicated because Impressionism can be considered a modernist art movement. Modern art is a lot bigger and a lot of way philosophical. Defining artwork as modern can feel somewhat counterintuitive because if we think about the word modern and how it is used in everyday language, it kind of takes off a different meaning, at least on how we use it. The definition of the word modern is relating to the present or recent times as opposed to the remote past. However, modern art hit the scene as early as 1800s, which most of us does not feel particularly recent. So we're kind of in this pickle similar to that quote unquote contemporary art because all art is contemporary when it is made. And in a sense, a lot of art is modern when it is made, at least according to how we use the word modern colloquially. It's a little confusing, and our proximity to modern art is also what makes it feel weird. Like, 200 years ago is really not that long in history of human beings and art creation and all of that. So there are movements that similarly look like at the same time, but we don't recognize that way because history simplified it into something else. So we also see it clearly. It's also well documented. It's also philosophical, wittier in concept. There's a lot going on in modern art. Modern art arouses as a result of a historical period that is often known as modernity. In academic terms, modernity is a term used to describe the historical period as well as the cultural norms, attitudes, and practices that arose from the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment. 17th and 18th century are considered the early modern period, while 19th and early 20th century are often defined as the modern era. The end of the modern era is widely debated, but many historians mark the end of the period with World War II. However, within art history, a great deal of art created post World War II is often as defined modern, so that makes it more confusing. A few things that modernism, both culturally and in relation to art, is defined by a rejection of tradition, prioritization of the individual, the concept of progress, rationalization, secularism, the move from agrarianism to capitalism, industrialization, market economy, and consumerism. These are all according to the French philosopher Paul Michel Foucault, who is often considered a postmodern philosopher. The first half of the 20th century was a period of significant upheaval worldwide. Between 1900 and 1945, the major industrial powers fought two global wars. Of course, we know that World War I, World War II. They also witnessed the rise of communism, fascism, and Nazism, and also suffered the Great Depression in the US. These decades were also a time of radical change in the arts, when artists challenged some of the most basic assumptions about the purpose of art and what form an artwork should take. Throughout history, artistic revolution has often accompanied a political, social, and economic upheaval, but never before artists had the new directions and explored as pronounced or as long lasting as those born during the first half of the last century. Modern art, including postmodern art, are works that were created between the years 1860 to 1970. Modern art is the creative world's response to the rationalist practices and perspectives of the new lives and ideas provided by the technological advances of the industrial age that caused contemporary society to manifest itself in new ways compared to the past. In simple terms, modern art describes a style and philosophy of art power packed with theories, movements, and attitudes in which the tradition of the past have been thrown aside in the spirit of experimentation. And the reason we are focusing on this time period is because it marks a drastic change and period of experimentation that begins in the span of our history. So, when comparing work that was made before and after this period, from the humanist inquiries of the Renaissance, we will notice that we go from images that look fairly realistic to these bizarre abstract representation of their subjects. It is also mostly due to the invention of the camera and like the widespread use of photography that began around 1850. Before the invention of photography, the primary role of the painter was to record people and events as accurately as possible. So rather than artists being responsible for recording history as accurately as possible, they can now start experimenting with aesthetics. So, what is aesthetic? Aesthetic refers to the philosophy of beauty carried by certain individuals and subcultures. So, there are what we call the art ho aesthetic, dark academia aesthetic, ethereal aesthetic, grunge aesthetic, hype beast, vintage, minimalist, or whatever. It all refers to the way things look and the certain things that people honor visually within those subcultures. Artists are grouped into movements according to their particular aesthetics. So, artists from different art movements have a certain aesthetic. Another important event that took place in the late 1800s was when James Abbott McNeill Whistler, remember his work, sued his harshest critic John Ruskin for libel when Ruskin criticized his painting Nocturne of Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket. Ruskin wrote, I have seen and heard much of Cockney impudence before now, but never expected to hear a coxcomb and ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public space. So, upon reading this, Whistler sued Ruskin for his criticism, and they both went to court. And actually, the jury was just lasted for 2 days. Eventually, Whistler won the case. But, anyways, this event represents an important schism and how many thought about art throughout the modern era. Ruskin believed that art is meant to improve society and that this is accomplished through faithful representation of the natural world, while Whistler, on the other hand, is the proponent of art for art's sake, which sought pure aesthetic sensation rather than the moralistic or sentimental subject matter. As we begin to explore modern art, various modernist movements align themselves with one of these philosophies and some kind of synthesize the two. Their story represents the shift into modernism when we have two people arguing the courtroom, trying to argue whether or not which is art or what is not. And it would go on telling on what would happen in modern art. Because throughout the entire course of modern art, it's almost constant thing like is this art or is it not art over and over again every time someone does something that is breaking tradition and pushing boundaries. And so it really represents that kind of shift in the art world.
As the old social orders collapsed and new ones, from communism to corporate capitalism, artists search for new definitions and uses for art in a radically changed world. Each successive modernist movement had challenged artistic conventions with ever greater intensity. Avant garde is a French term from military usage which means front guard. It also refers to things that are ahead of their time and not quite yet understood or embraced by the majority.
Avant garde artists were the vanguard or trailblazers. They rejected the classical, academic, and traditional and zealously explored the premises and formal qualities of painting and sculpture. Their objective in the modern era was to advance the practices and ideas of art and to continually challenge what constituted acceptable artistic form in order to most accurately convey the artist's experience of modern life. Modern artists continually examined the past and revalued it in relation to the modern. Their styles were more or less hated and rejected by the public. People didn't understand it or they didn't find it aesthetically as pleasing. Many works by modern artists were labeled degenerate and destroyed by the Nazis. Hitler especially hated modern art. He called it degenerate art. It was deemed unacceptable to him, and as a result, much of it was burned and destroyed as the Nazis came into power during the World War II. Sometimes people just have difficulty embracing change. Change in the context of art and culture often follows a pattern. When we look at the styles that appear over the course of modern art, we will notice a definite pattern. Compare movements that came before it from the previous art periods. We see this pattern like a tension and release. We have this very complex, very ornate, and decorative style, followed by a style that is, by contrast, very abstract and simplified. This also happens in fashion, in music, trends that people follow. In order for something to appear something new and totally different, for a trend to be new and exciting, it must contrast with the current style. It must contrast with its predecessor. So that's what that's all about.
So we have the timeline here ties to the events of the World War One and World War Two. We can imagine that people's lives were totally upside down by the events of the war. Cultural artifacts were destroyed, cities were bombed out, many people were displaced, and many of these movements and style existed as a sort of a coping mechanism, and then others out of need for society to reconstruct itself and pick up the pieces after the war.
Fauvism is an art movement in the 1900s that free colors from its descriptive function. The Fauves used arbitrary colors as the primary means of conveying feeling. It is an art movement in which participants use color in a very non traditional way. They employ the use of arbitrary color or random color, and although this is nothing new to us now, it was very shocking and controversial to people in the early 1900s.
The term fauve is a French form for wild beasts because of their random colors and the way which they apply the paint. Art critics thought that they were pretty wild, so that's why they were called this.
Fauvism can be classified as an extreme development of Van Gogh's post-impressionism fused with pointillism of Seurat and the employment of areas of saturated colors from Cézanne and Gauguin. The Fauves were characterized by seemingly wild brushwork and bold colors, while their subject matter had high degree of simplification and abstraction. Leading artists were André Dron and Henri Matisse. Matisse's departure in The Joy of Life took a separation of colors as a purely expressive medium divorced from optical sensation. It can also introduce the idea of primitivism in 20th century modernism, if you remember the report about primitivism. At a moment of rapid industrialization and modernization, artists like Matisse chose to paint naive works of art in a manner that suggests a natural state of simplicity. In The Joy of Life, yellow, blue green, and pink nudes, they dance, sing, and frolic in the untouched multicolored Eden. By alternately exaggerating and simplifying forms, Matisse made artistic choices that emphasized the canvas as a two dimensional support for the harmonious juxtaposition of color rather than any sort of accurate representation of nature. Matisse's exploration of the expressive power of color reached maturity in the Red Room, which is shown here on the right. In an essay entitled Notes of a Painter, Henri Matisse responded to his critics and set forth his principles and goals as a painter. He said, "The chief function of color should serve expression as well as possible. Dot, dot, dot. My choice of colors does not rest on any scientific theory. It is based on observation, on sensibility, on felt experience. This idea that art could be about something greater than mere representations marked a radical shift that was taken up by two modernism's major movements, Expressionism and Cubism.
Expressionism was a movement developed in the early 20th century, mainly in Germany, as a reaction to the dehumanizing effect of industrialization and the growth of cities. People were spending their days working in factories or at the machinery. Their working conditions were not good. The factory environment was soul crushing. Life was very difficult, and not everyone could afford to live comfortably. There was a culture of malaise and depression that sprang up around. And also, German artists living in major cities were growing restless and tired of the traditional bourgeois social conventions and academic traditions that being taught. Expressionist artists sought to, above all else, convey strong emotions in their artwork. This is a movement focused on feelings and self expression through line and color and stripping back from things like representation. That aspect, which once again is seen in some modern art movement. Their artistic values promoted the symbolic power of color and believed that art could communicate powerful, positive, or spiritual messages to the viewer. Expressionism, largely a German invention, was represented by two major groups, Die Brücke and Der Blaureiter. Die Brücke, or the Bridge, was founded in Dresden in 1905 by four architecture students, Fritz Bleil, Erich Heckel, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, and Carl Smith Rottluff. Their name came from the philosophical writing of Friedrich Nietzsche, and they shared the philosopher's idea that the present day can positively influence the future, acting as a bridge to the future. Die Brücke artists incorporated figural distortions, a primitivist directness of rendering, and an expressiveness of color that linked it to Fauvism. Diebrike artists emotionally agitated paintings of city streets and sexually charged events transpiring in country settings. This is the poster of their first exhibition, designed by Fritz Blyle, and some works of the Diebrike artists. In the painting Street Dresden, Die Brücke founder Ernst Ludwig Kirchner uses those ideas, like the agitated paintings of city streets and sexually charged events, to express the feelings of alienation within the modern city. If we describe the joy of life of Matisse here on the right, compared to Street Dresden of Kirchner, the joy of life is an idyllic scene of healthy bodies in a natural harmony, while Kirchner's scene reports the mask like, made up faces of women in the too tight city street environment. Though these women address the viewer, their eyes are blackened. It implied an inability or unwillingness to make basic human connections, a concern over the effects of modernity. Der Blaue Reiter, or the Blue Rider, was formed in 1911 in Munich and focused on the possibility of pure abstraction, or the art without recognizable objects. Members included the Russian painter Vasily Kandinsky and German artists Franz Marc. Marc was interested in the symbolism of the color blue, and he believed that blue was the most spiritual color. Vasily Kandinsky wrote an influential treatise entitled On the Spiritual in Art in 1910 that, among other things, argued that abstraction offered a universality that representation could not, and that color acted autonomously from form as a carrier for spiritual values thought to be lost in the experience of modernity. Here is a painting of Kandinsky entitled Composition 7, which provides a concept of abstraction. As Kandinsky suggests, if color could exist outside of form, what would it look like? Kandinsky was fond of comparing visual art to music. He considers terms mutually used to describe art and music, like tone and harmony. Music in the eyes of the Expressionists was the perfect metaphor for abstract art. Though it has form and tone, though it can be felt and heard, its forms cannot be seen. Apparently represented different parts of the musical composition that he was hearing. He did this by using a process called automatism, which meant that he would just let himself zone out and allow his subconscious mind to take over as he was painting. Though the forms here are all unrecognizable, Kandinsky communicates clamor, conflict, and violent energies through his manipulation of form and color from objective reality. Some art historians concluded that the work is a combination of themes of resurrection, Judgment Day, the Flood, and the Garden of Eden. Kandinsky's theories and paintings on the spiritual quality of visual art were extremely influential for modern art. The works of Kandinsky provides a nice transition to the next movement, which is abstract expressionism. Expressionism made a major impact in the 20th century art due to their philosophical goals and interests in expressive abstraction. One important precursor of Expressionism is the Belgian artist James Ensor, whose works features creepy carnivals, masks, puppets, and skeletons. And of course, we have the Norwegian artist Edvard Munch, who is best known for his 1893 painting titled The Scream, but also has a variety of other really gorgeous artworks that we seldom see because they were overshadowed by The Scream. He was known as a symbolist and early expressionist artist. His works was greatly influential during the height of expressionism. Fauvism and Expressionism overlapped as the Expressionists employed the Fauves' practice of using arbitrary colors so that they were able to convey strong emotions. From painting, German Expressionism also spread to other art forms, especially in cinema. German Expressionist cinema movement was initially confined to Germany due to the isolation the country experienced during World War One. In 1916, the government had banned foreign films. The demand from theaters to generate films led to an increase in domestic film production from 24 films in 1914 to 130 films in 1918. That's a lot. The first Expressionist films made up for a lack of lavish budgets by using set designs with wildly non realistic, geometrically absurd angles, along with designs painted on walls and floors to represent lights, shadows, and also objects. The plots and stories of the Expressionist films often dealt with madness, insanity, betrayal, and other intellectual quote unquote topics triggered by the experiences of the World War One. German Expressionist cinema rejected the naturalistic depiction of objective reality. They often portray distorted figures, buildings, and landscapes in a disorienting manner that disregarded the conventions of perspective and proportion. This approach, combined with jagged, stylized shapes and harsh and natural colors, were used to convey subjective emotions. Films like Metropolis by Fritz Lang, The Student of Praha, Nosferatu, Phantom, etc. are just examples of films. On the right side is a film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari by Robert Hine, is a story of an insane hypnotist who uses a somnambulist or a sleepwalker to commit murders. German Expressionist influenced directors like Alfred Hitchcock, Werner Herzog, Ridley Scott, Tim Burton, and many others. As many embraced avant garde cinema, art, architecture, and theater, it came to an abrupt end in 1933 when Hitler's Nazi Party came to power. Expressionism continued in a fragmented way to create emotive work. Their influence survived in later art movements like abstract expressionism and neo expressionism. After the Second World War, Expressionism was rediscovered and reclaimed in Germany as a part of their true heritage. From the previous reports and as we go along with modern art, we noticed that the movements or art styles has becoming more and more abstract. Now, what is abstract art and when did it start? Abstract art, also called non objective art or non representational art, in which the portrayal of things from the visible world plays little or no part at all. In abstract art, that something is one of the visual elements of a subject. Its lines, shapes, tones, patterns, textures, or forms. Abstract can be described into two methods, the semi abstraction and pure abstraction. Semi abstraction is where the image still has one foot in representational art, like cubism and futurism. On the other hand, pure abstraction is where the visual elements independently as the actual subject of the work itself. Abstract art, in its strictest sense, has its origins in the 19th century. It's the period where characterized by a vast of elaborate representational art produced for the sake of illustrating anecdotes. It also produced a number of painters who examined the mechanism of light and visual perception. The period of Romanticism had put forward ideas about art that denied classicism's emphasis on imitation and idealization and had instead stressed the role of imagination and of the unconscious as the essential creative factors. The English Romantic painter J.M.W. Turner's painting, like The Slave Ship in 1840, it already showed an early abstraction. His techniques were carefully studied by the Impressionist artist Claude Monet. Turner is also generally regarded as a precursor of abstract painting. All the major movements of the first 2 decades of the 20th century, including Fauvism, Expressionism, Cubism, and Futurism, in some ways emphasize the gap between art and natural appearances. There is, however, a deep distinction between abstracting from appearances, even if to the point of unrecognizability, and making works out of forms not drawn from the visible world. During the 4 or 5 years preceding World War I, such artists as Robert Delaunay, Vasily Kandinsky, Kazimir Malevich, and Vladimir Tatlin turned to fundamentally abstract art. Robert Delaunay is known for Orphism or Orphic Cubism, which focused more on abstraction and bright colors influenced by Fauvism. It is perceived as a key in the transition from Cubism to abstract art. Vasily Kandinsky, of course, we discussed about him earlier. Kazimir Malevich is the founder of Suprematism. Vladimir is a constructivist artist. Kandinsky was traditionally regarded as the first modern artist to paint purely abstract pictures containing no recognizable objects in 1910 to 1911. However, it was later questioned, especially in the 21st century, with a renewed interest in Swedish artist Hilma af Klint. She painted her first abstract work in 1906, Primordial Chaos, but with a different goal than achieving pure abstraction. Her works are mainly spiritual and was inspired by the Theosophical movement. During World War I, the emergence of the De Stijl group in the Netherlands and of the Dada group in Zurich further widened the spectrum of abstract art. Here are 4 pictures of Theo van Doesburg. It is the 4 stages and sequence of abstraction of the image of a cow. So from the first picture, it is drawn in a naturalistic way, and then turning into basic shapes, and then finally it's totally abstracted. If you remember, Theo van Doesburg is the founder and leader of the style movement in Netherlands. Abstract art did not flourish between World Wars I and II, beset by totalitarian politics and by art movements placing renewed emphasis on imagery, such as surrealism and socially critical realism. It received little notice, but after World War II, an energetic American school of abstract painting called Abstract Expressionism emerged and had wide influence. So, beginning in the 1950s, abstract art was accepted and widely practiced approach within European and American painting and sculpture. Abstract art puzzled and indeed confused many people, but for those who accepted its non referential language, there is no doubt as to its value and achievement. Suprematism, constructivism, and the style. What's really the difference? I mean, this style is a little bit confusing, especially suprematism and constructivism because of their appearance. And they are also both Russian in origin. Suprematism was developed in 1915 by Russian artist Kazimir Malevich. It is an abstract style of painting derived from Cubism and Futurism. Malevich rejected any use of representational images. He believed that the non representational forms of pure abstraction had a greater spiritual power and an ability to open the mind to the quote unquote the supremacy of pure feeling. Suprematism is of pure abstraction that advocated a mystical approach to art, in contrast with constructivism, whose imagery served the social and political ideology of the state. Supremas is a group of Russian avant garde artists led by Malevich as a first attempt to found the Russian avant garde movement as an artistic entity within its own historical development. Constructivism was also developed by the Russian avant garde at the time of the October Revolution of 1917, declaring that a post revolutionary society demanded a radically new artistic language. Constructivist artists led by Alexander Rodchenko and Vladimir Tetlin aimed to strip their works of subjective emotional character, eventually even rejecting painting as an individualist bourgeois form. The constructivist artist was recast as an engineer of a new society whose practice served greater social or utilitarian purpose. They still use the same geometric language as suprematism, but abandoned its mystical vision in favor of their socialism of vision. It is a utopian glimpse of mechanized modernity according to the ideals of October Revolution. However, this was not an art that was easily understood by the proletariat, and it was eventually repressed and rejected by the socialist realism. Alexander Rodchenko, Vladimir Tetlin, Elizitsky, and Nomkabo were among the best artists associated with constructivism. And when we speak about constructivism, its ideals and principles are mostly applied in graphic design and architecture. In comparison of the three, suprematism, constructivism, and the style, the first picture here is a painting by Kazimir Malevich. He developed a whole range of forms, including rectangles, triangles, and circles, often in intense, beautiful colors. These forms are floated against a usually white ground, and the feeling of color and space in suprematist painting is a crucial aspect of it. The painting's suprematist composition, airplane flying, the brightly colored shapes float against within the white space, and the artist placed them in a dynamic relationship to one another. Malevich believed everyone would easily understand his new art because of the universality of its symbols. It used the pure language of shape and color to which all people could respond intuitively. So here it's an airplane flying, but we really don't recognize it as an airplane flying. It's one of the suprematist ideals and principles. The second picture is a painting by Alexander Rodchenko, a constructivist artist. The material formation of the object is to be substituted to its aesthetic combination. The object is to be treated as a whole and thus will be of no discernible style, but simply a product of an industrial order like a car or an aeroplane and such like. Constructivism is purely a mastery and organization of materials. And lastly, on the other hand, the style is a Dutch style of pure abstraction. Piet Mondrian was a spiritual man that intent on developing a universal visual language that was free from any hint of the nationalism that led to the Great War. Grid of lines and primary colors were configured in a series of compositions that explored his universal principles of harmony. So here, vertical lines embodied the direction of the energy of sun's rays. These were countered by horizontal lines relating to the Earth's movement around it. He saw primary colors through the same cosmic tinted spectacles. Yellow radiated the sun's energy, blue receded as infinite space, and red materialized where blue and yellow met. Mondrian's style was inspired by the theosophical beliefs of the mathematician and philosopher M. H. J. Schumacher's. Let's go back a little bit about Dada and how it affects and influence the next art movements in the 20th century and even the 21st century. So, for many intellectuals, World War One produced a collapse of confidence in the rhetoric, if not the principles of the culture of rationality that had prevailed in Europe since the Enlightenment. Dada embraced and parodied that confusion. Dada wished to replace the logical nonsense of the men of today with the illogical nonsense. The absurdist outlook of Dada spread like a pandemic, as Tara called Dada a virgin micro, and there were outbreaks from Berlin to Paris, New York, and even in Tokyo. And for all this zaniness, the movement would prove to be one of the most influential in modern art, foreshadowing abstract and conceptual art, performance art, op art, pop art, and installation art. But Dada would die out in less than a decade and has not the kind of major museum retrospective it deserves until now. I mean, really? And talking about ready-mades, these are important within the context of art history because they force to question the criteria that we have regarding the nature of art, like what makes something art and what makes something not art. Dadaists sought to free creative impulses from rules and limitations, thus making the act of creating art accessible to everyone.
Iko bloiko, rusula huju. Holaka holala, halaku boom, blaku boom, blaku boom. Posso fataka, susubudu, subudu, gulabudu. Asabatu sa, sababaluka, buka kaloma. Ahoy, ahoy. Voilà, c'est-à-dire, prenez ça pour chaîne, quand l'air, grenouille, du rhum, commentaire, brûlé, gire, mieux, l'œil, cheval, blanc, lame, rhum, serpent, l'arrêt, on, des bandades, miel, d'amis, dorénavant, pire, terre, train, intéressé, aiguille, terre, morsure, équatoriale. Vivant, de éléphants, urbain, versailles, l'enlève. Pour 15 ans, devint télégraphiste, sensation. La conseil, adieu, Mathieu, bon, cher, c'est, la rue, sans avec.
Dada's last hurrah sounded in Paris in 1920s when Zara, Ernst, Duchamp, and other Dada pioneers took part in a series of exhibitions of provocative art, nude performances, rowdy stage productions, and incomprehensible manifestos. The movement was falling apart. André Breton issued his own Dada manifestos, but it fell in feuding with Zara's. Picabia was fed up and left the scene. Breton gloated that Dada, unfortunately, is no longer an issue, and its funeral, about May 1921, caused no rioting. But Dada wasn't quite dead yet and soon leaped from the grave. Arp's abstraction, Schwitter's constructions, Picabia's targets and stripes, and Duchamp's ready-mades were soon turning up in the work of major 20th century artists and art movements. From Stuart Davis' abstractions, Andy Warhol's pop art, from Jasper John's target and flags, to Robert Rauschenberg's collages and combines, almost anywhere you look in postmodern and contemporary art, Dada did it first. Even Breton, who died in 1966, recanted his disdain for Dada. He wrote, "Fundamentally, since Dada, we have done nothing." A lot of movements and art styles emerged during the 20th century, but This practice of grouping artists into movements is not always completely accurate or appropriate, as many movements or schools consist of widely diverse artists and modes of artistic representation. For example, Vincent van Gogh, Paul Gauguin, Georges Seurat, and Paul Cézanne are considered the principal artists of post-Impressionism. It was a movement of artists' deviation from Impressionist motifs as well as their chronological place in the history. Unlike their predecessor, however, the post Impressionists did not represent a cohesive movement of artists who united under a single ideological banner. Some artists do not fit into any particular movement or category. Key examples are Paul Klee, Auguste Rodin, Amadeo Modigliani, and Marc Chagall. Despite these complications of designation of movements, it allows the vast history of modern art to be broken down into smaller segments separated by contextual factors that aid in examining the individual artist's artworks. The Bauhaus, or in English, House of Building. It is a German school of design and architecture in which artists tried to reduce all things to their simplest forms. It was founded at Weimar in 1919 with Walter Gropius as the first director. The faculty of the school included artists as famous as Paul Klee, Lionel Fininger, Vasily Kandinsky, and Marcel Breuer. The school was founded to unite fine arts like painting and sculpture with applied arts like industrial design and building design. Architect Walter Gropius was so upset by the rapid industrialization of the era without any thought for artistic quality or humanity, and the large rift between fine arts and the applied arts during that time. So there were a merger of two Grand Ducal Saxon Academy of Fine Art and the Grand Ducal Saxon School of Arts and Crafts, and it resulted of the birth of the architecture school with Gropius leading the charge as director. Indisputably, the Bauhaus art had been well adapted to the modern and industrial society. It was an art of modernization. Gropius once said, "A modern man who wears modern, not historical dress also requires a modern dwelling which is in harmony with himself and with the time in which he lives, and is equipped with all the modern objects in daily use." This remark made by Walter Gropius was a proof of his determination of accepting modernization and industrialization. He even tried to combine all the skills of craftsmen, painters, and sculptors in building modern architecture. So, over the next 14 years, the school went through several relocations and several directors, and its goals and tenets fluctuated with each change. However, as a core, the Bauhaus School's driving force was to aim to reintegrate art and industrialization. What are the characteristics of Bauhaus architecture or Bauhaus design? One, functional shapes. Bauhaus design features little to no embellishment or ornamentation, instead, drawing attention to the streamlined design. So simple. Number two, simple color schemes. Bauhaus design aims for cohesion and simplicity for so architectural color schemes are often limited to basic industrial colors like white, gray, and beige. In interior design, primary colors are often used. Three, the industrial materials. Since it focuses on simplicity and industrialism, it most often tries to incorporate the fewest different materials possible, like concrete, steel, and glass. Number four, the balance asymmetry. Bauhaus aimed for visual balance through asymmetry, not symmetry, because they see symmetry, they considered it too industrial without any artistic heart. And number five, it's holistic design. Among the essential tenets of Bauhaus design is integrating the school's techniques into every element of life, including city design, street corners, building architecture, furniture design, appliances, even eating utensils, and of course, typography. Up to this time, Bauhaus is very influential, especially in design and architecture. Main reason of it is it ushered the modern wave. Before and during the rise of Bauhaus, design trends were highly decorative and ornate, including the Victorian style and the colonial style. So Bauhaus revolutionized the design field by aiming for simple, functional buildings and furniture. And it also popularized the industrialized materials. The Bauhaus likely influenced the glass, steel, and concrete materials that have become the staple or modern interior design. Before, these materials were considered displeasing or utilitarian, so the school reimagined these materials as sleek, simple, and beautiful in their functionality. And lastly, it influenced modern course instruction. The Bauhaus School have a unique syllabus design. In their first year in introductory classes, it covered subjects like color theory and design principles. And after the preliminary course, students would move on to more advanced technical courses. This class structure has been adopted by many schools of architecture and design around the world. Also, UP adopted this kind of educational structure. Although the Bauhaus condemned ornamentation in the design of buildings, popular taste still favored decoration as an important element in architecture. Art Deco was a movement or style in the 1920s and 1930s that acquired its name at the Exposition of Modern Decorative and Industrial Arts held in Paris in 1925. Art Deco had universal application to buildings, interiors, furniture, utensils, jewelry, fashion, illustration, and commercial products of every sort. Art Deco products have a streamlined, elongated, symmetrical aspect. Simple, flat, geometric shapes alternate with shallow volumes in hard patterns. It is in contrast to the free flowing, flowery, organic look that defined Art Nouveau. Since then, the term Art Deco has been applied to a wide variety of works produced during the interwar years and even to those of German Bauhaus. But essentially, Art Deco is French in origin, a style in reaction of Art Nouveau. And the term should therefore be applied only to French works and those from countries directly influenced by France. There were three prominent figures in Art Deco. We have Cassander, whose real name is Adolphe Jean Marie Miron. He is a French Ukrainian painter and commercial artist known for his bizarre magazine covers and travel posters. If we have Alphonse Mucha as a figure of Art Nouveau, in Art Deco we have Romain de Tetrov. He is also known for his pseudonym Urte. He is like the father of Art Deco. His designs take a very serious nod to Japanese style prints. He was like a fashion designer and he also designed for theaters. And he was like all over the place. The exemplary Art Deco masterpiece is the stainless steel spire of the Chrysler Building in New York City, designed by William Van Allen in 1882 to 1954. The building and spire are monuments to the fabulous 1920 when American millionaires and corporations competed with one another to raise the tallest skyscrapers in the biggest cities. Built up of diminishing fan shapes, the spire glitters triumphantly in the sky, a resplendent crown honoring the business achievements of the great auto manufacturer, of course, Chrysler. As a temple of commerce, the Chrysler Building celebrated the principles and success of American business before the onset of the Great Depression. In summary, modernity is a term that is often used in the academia to describe this whole era that is very much defined by post industrialization, capitalism, progress, rationalization, the prioritization of individual. It's very important. It's this whole time period that arose out of the Industrial Revolution, out of the Enlightenment and World Wars. That's the time frame. And then the art that was created because of similar things, and often art that is rejecting tradition and engaging these ideas and concepts, which is again very philosophical, which is why a lot of people don't like modern art. And what is one of the main characteristics of modern art? It's challenging tradition. All of these movements stylistically can be so different, and even so, within these movements, stylistically, artist is working differently, but they all reject tradition. The underlying theme is rejection of something, and in that way, they all interact with each other because so many of them are looking at one type of art and saying, I rejected this about this, and I'm gonna do this. Another big thing about modern art is very, very much in conversation with all other art all the time, like how it operates. Rejecting something or commending something away from something, modern art only exists because other form of art exists.